right, hello to everybody who's joining us. We thought we'd start just a couple minutes before noon to let everyone have a chance to join. Make sure their audio is working well. Ooh, it's great. So many of you joining us. That's super. Okay. That's great. So we'll just, as I say, to those people who've just logged on, we're welcome, and we're going to give it another couple minutes for everyone to get logged on. But at least you have a chance to just check your audio, check your screen, make sure everything's working fine. And hello to Pam and to Jacob. I love the chat function. It's so fun when people connect, and it's fun also when you say where you're from too, because it's amazing how we can connect from far and wide through this really neat medium. Wow, there's quite a lot of us joining. That is super. That's very exciting. Oh, from Toronto, great. I'm just outside of Ottawa in Carleton Place, working from home as so many of us are nowadays. Oh, McMurray, Alberta from Newfoundland. That's so cool. I work on native bees in Manitoba. Looking forward to your talk. Oh, that's great. Well, Melanie, maybe we can chat after too in case there's a way we can work together. Janice from Prince Edward County, Fredericton, Montreal. This is awesome. Prince Edward County, Regina, Saskatchewan. And to those of you just joining, welcome. We're just giving it another minute or so for everyone just to log on and test their equipment and make sure it's fine. And welcome, please say hi, because this is lovely to see everybody. Oh, the calendar invite we got, can I forward it to someone else, or do they have to have signed up on their own? That's a very good question. If you forward it to them and it's got the link in it, I think it should work. But I've never been asked that question before, so I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer, but try it and let me know. Hi from rural Manitoba. Hello, Simone. Hello, Megan from Fredericton. That's great. And still so many more joining in. So actually, even though it's noon now, I think we'll give it another minute just to let everyone really get on board so they don't miss anything. St. John's, Bethany, Ontario. That's cool. Hope I haven't missed anyone. Hi from Ottawa. Hello. Great. Midhurst, Ontario. Oh, biologist from RBG. Oh, very cool. I took a course there once upon a time. Royal Botanical Garden. Leave. British Columbia, Vancouver, not raining yet. Oh, that's good. We've actually got a bit of sun here today. Essex County. Well, you know, it looks like we're at a steady number now. Hello, Anna from Duluth. Great. Watching with my 5-year-old before he goes to kindergarten. Oh, that's so wonderful. We love bees too. Oh, and I'm so glad that a child's involved as well. Another someone from the Royal Botanical Gardens. That's great. Horticultural teacher. Oh, super. So I think what we should do is get started now because, well, it's still people joining, but I think we should keep on time. So welcome everybody, and it's so wonderful to see so many of you here, so to speak. I'm Sarah Colbert with the Canadian Wildlife Federation, and we're so glad you're all here to learn about bees, our native bees, the really important part of our ecosystem. And I'm so glad we have here Cécile Antoine to help us with this, PhD candidate with the University of Ottawa. And before I hand it over to Cécile, what I just wanted to do very quickly is just a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm not sure if you're all familiar with this style of webinar. It's an actual webinar, not a meeting calling itself a webinar. So there's no chance for you to talk or show your camera. But again, there's the chat function, which many of you have used, which is super, to say hi and where you're from. And if you have questions, just if you move your mouse around the screen, well, I'm assuming you've seen that if you've entered into the chat, but for those of you who don't know, if you move your mouse around the screen, you'll get a bar somewhere on your screen and you'll see Q&A. So if you click the Q&A, that's where you can type your questions. And we're going to save the questions for the end of the webinar. That way Cecile can just simply move through. And then at the end, about, we're hoping around 1:45-ish, we'll stop and then we'll field all the questions then. So I think that's all I have to say. At the end of the webinar, I think maybe even 5 days, we'll send out a follow-up email. I'll add in some pertinent links based on your questions to help with that. And there'll also be a chance to access a recording and of this webinar and a chance to do a survey. It's a very brief survey. It helps us know what you're interested in, where your gardening expertise or interests are at, so we can continue to help support Canadians and more in terms of wildlife-friendly gardening. And if you do that as well, you get access to our electronic wildlife-friendly gardening guide, which has some great tips about creating habitat with food, water, and shelter, and how you maintain that space in an earth-friendly manner, which is a big part of our Gardening for Wildlife program. So I'm going to hand it over to Cecile now. So if you want to share your screen. Oh, is everyone sending messages just to panelists, or is the public chat disabled? It shouldn't be disabled, it should be to everybody, I think. But anyway, I'll just close that down now and I'll mute myself and away we go.
Can you see my screen? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to this webinar on wild bees. Today I will be talking about bee biology and ecology, their importance as pollinators and the threats they're facing. I will also talk a little bit about my research here in Ottawa and some conservation tips to promote and preserve bees. Okay, so first I'll introduce myself. I am a fourth year PhD student at the University of Ottawa. As you can probably hear, English is my second language. I am from France, where I hold an engineering degree in agronomy, and I've worked with beekeepers before back in France, and that's how I discovered the world of bees and my passion for them. Then I chose to move to Canada to pursue a PhD on native bees, and so this is what we'll be talking about today. And if you have any questions or comments, you can email me in either language. And you can also check our lab website if you're interested to see other students' projects. When we think about bees, this is the image we usually have. We think about the domesticated bees that produce honey, pollen, and wax, among other things, and that live in hives. The honeybee is not native from Canada. They actually have been introduced from Europe in the 16th century, hence the name Western honeybee that some people use. I might mention the honeybee in my presentation a few times, but I will focus on the native wildlife of this region because there are thousands of species of bees. Not all of them make honey, not all of them wear stripes or black and yellow, and most of them actually live a solitary life. Here are some examples of the wide diversity in morphology, size, and colors among bees. There are more than 20,000 species worldwide and about 900 species in Canada. In comparison, there's about 5,400 species of mammals, 11,000 species of birds. So there's actually twice more species of bees than birds. Some species only occur in some specific areas with a small home range. Others are broader. And so on the left, you can see the world's largest bee compared to the size of a honeybee. And then on the bottom, you can see the tiniest bee of the genus Perdita compared to one of the biggest bee of the genus Xylocopa. Those big black bees, we don't have them in Ottawa, but there are some south in the Toronto region. They actually make a huge noise for wildfire flying. I really like them. And the picture on the right, well, this is the image I want you to have when you think about bees, because they show the diversity that we have, and some are big fatty ones, some are super thin, some are green, yellow, gray, brown, red or black ones, but all of them are beautiful. Often people make mistakes and they don't recognize bees as they are. Because bees can be very small. So bees have two pair of wings, in contrary to flies that only have one. A bee head is quite round with separated eyes and long antennas. Um, Bees have branched hairs on their body, and zooming in on the hair, you understand that this adaptation helps to carry pollen on their body. Most species of bees have modified legs to carry a ball of pollen. And here are some examples of bees carrying pollen on their legs. When doing so, they usually groom their body and form a ball of pollen. Sometimes it will be under their abdomen, like this bee on the top. And some species, like bumblebees, will mix the pollen with nectar to make the ball more compact. Pollen can be different colors. They can be white, gray, yellow, orange, red, or even purple. It depends on the flowers. And the bee's diet consists of pollen that is rich in sugar and is a fuel for adults. And pollen is the must-have resource for larvae growth. There is actually a gradient of specializations on the flowers. Some bees are very generalist, and they visit several botanical families and a broad range of flowers that also vary in morphology and colors. Some bees are more specialist and will only be visiting species from the same genus or from the same plant family. On this picture, for example, there is this green shiny bee. I think it's the orchid bee, and they specialize on orchid flowers. And the one in the middle looks like the hoary squash bee that specializes on squash flowers. And this species usually nests under squash plants, and the male sleeps in the flowers at night. It's very cute. Changes and evolution of the bodies of these insects, especially for bees. They have the tongue length, the leg modification, the hair, the colors, the body size. They adapt to the morphology of the flowers, and flowers and bees have co-evolved together for more than 100 million years. So bees were harvesting floral resources, and the flowering plants were using the insects to pollinate their flowers. But you can ask yourself, what is pollination exactly? Well, it is the transfer of pollen from the anthers, the male, to the stigma, the female organ. A different plant of the same species, resulting in ovule fertilization and formation of the seed. It is necessary for the plant reproduction to use a vector when they're not self-compatible and they can't fertilize themselves. So it is also a way to ensure genetic diversity among a population of plants. Many animals and insects are classified as pollinators. As you can see on the right with the different pictures, there are butterflies, hummingbirds, beetles, flies, and bees. But the morphology and the behavior of the bees makes them remarkable. Pollinators are important for the ecosystem service they provide that benefits us humans. While it is difficult to estimate the economic value of such a service, It is worth billions of dollars per year because pollinators and especially bees allow the reproduction of 90% of flowering plants and 75%, so about 3/4 of crops, are dependent to some extent on this pollination, like apples, for example. The picture of the trees are flowering on the right. And on the bottom, you can see pictures of a typical example of breakfast with and without pollinators. So on the right, there's coffee, chocolate, nuts, fruits, and vegetables. But on the left, there's less of that and less milk too, because forage crops are also pollinated by bees. So without pollinators, we would be mainly eating cereals because they're wind pollinated plants. A topic with high media coverage is the threats that honeybees are facing. And what we know is that in 2006, beekeepers sounded the alarm and alerted the politicians and media about honeybee death. Beekeepers were founding a pile of dead bees on their apiaries, or other times fear were just disappearing. These observations were made in several countries in North America and Europe, and the name given to these symptoms is the colony collapse disorder. So beekeepers are losing on average 30% of their hives per year, mostly in the winter, compared to 10% before, which is the normal rate. And they suffer a decrease in honey production. So those threats honeybees are facing raise the question about the dangers that wild bees are facing. So what about wild bees then? Well, it is a difficult question to answer because of the lack of historical data. Unfortunately, there's little long-term data to compare. A study made in England and the Netherlands compared the periods before and after the 1980 and observed a decrease in the diversity and even local extensions of some species. Overall, bumblebee species are known to have become extinct locally or are considered at risk, contracting their distribution with smaller ranges. Studies have shown a loss of global diversity, and the causes lies in the multiple interactions between several factors limiting bee populations: urbanization, agriculture, climate change, parasites, invasive species, etc., and their interactions. And one of the threat is also the habitat of wild bees. So this brings me to my research question. I want to better understand the nesting habitat requirements for ground nesting bees. And just to clarify, in the word habitat, there are two things implied for bee ecologists: the food resources, which means flowers that provide adequate amount of pollen and nectar, and the potential nest sites and materials. But what can be considered a nest site and nest materials for bees? Well, bees can be divided in three groups regarding their nesting type: cavity nesters, that excavate their own nest in the wood or use pre-existing cavities in the walls, wood, stems, and etc. They usually use leaves, mud, or resin to build their inner walls of their nests. Ground nesters that dig a nest below ground. And then the last category are the parasitic bees that, rather than building a nest, they invade the nest of other bee species. And it's a behavior similar to the cuckoo bird, hence their common name, cuckoo bees. So I will be focusing a little bit more about ground nesting bees because they represent about 3/4 of the bee species, and they're very diverse. So although the ground nesting strategy is observed in every bee family, in solitary and social species, and in every habitat in which bees occur, ground nesting bees are proportionally far less studied than cavity nesters. We know very little about their nesting requirements, and this is why I'm interested to learn more about them. So I finished a review this summer that combined all the existing literature on ground nesting bees, and it's in the process of being published in a scientific journal. Ground nesters dig tunnels underground, sometimes deep in the ground, but on average 18 centimeters, as you can see on the picture. They create cells where they pack a pollen reserve and they lay eggs on top of it. It is very difficult, though, to spot a nest entrance of an underground nest. Sometimes they're more conspicuous with a tumulus at the entrance, but most of the time they're barely visible. And these are pictures of some nests that I found on the field. And you can see with the scale here of this picture on the left, they're very, very small. They can be hidden in cracks or just with leaves. They're sometimes near rocks. And this is on the right, it's a picture of squash bee nests, as I mentioned before, because they nest under the squash plants, so they're easier to find. They're also they're bigger bees, so they make bigger nest entrances. Well, their nest entrances are bigger, so they're a bit easier to find and locate. But these are the nests that I was able to spot, and the others are too tiny and well hidden. The activity period for most species only lasts for a few weeks for wild bees, and they start with the adult emergence, as in the graph here, followed very shortly by mating, and then females start building a nest, constructing one cell at a time, as in the drawing. Sorry, and they forage for pollen and nectar. They will create food reserves and lay the eggs, and then the offspring development vary in duration, depending on the species. And you can see here a picture of the larvae feeding on a pollen ball. And when they reach prepupal stage, they sometimes overwinter in that stage. And then they will emerge the next season. Bees, when creating their nest, they usually have multiple cells in it, and they have multiple offsprings per nest. Most species are solitary, and it's the female who build the nest and forage for flowers. Usually males are just useful for reproduction. So there's a need to understand the factors that can limit and promote wild bee communities to be able to protect them and conserve them. So this is why I did a study on farms around Ottawa. I want to study the nesting requirements of ground nesting bees. So just to be able to make recommendations to farmers about the soil features that bees prefer and what they can do to protect them. So I made a project on farms around Ottawa. I sampled the wild bee community in about 40 farms in 2018 and 2019. Initially, I intended to work at the nest level, but as I said before, it was too difficult to find enough nests. So I decided to use traps to catch the bees and get an idea of the presence of this or that species depending on the surrounding environment. So these traps are a standard technique used in entomology. They are bowls of colors filled with water and a few drops of soap. As you can see, the balls are on the left here. and the soap allowed to break the surface tension of the water. So the result is that when an insect lands on the trap, it's usually attracted by the color or the shape of the ball. It drowns, and so I can collect the insect. It's a method to collect the insects to be able to identify them later. And my goal wasn't to kill all living insects in the area, so I only captured for 2 days, once per month, for 5 months each year. I finished all the fieldwork part of the study, and I pinned and labels all the bees that I collected. And now I'm in the process of identifying the bees. I use identification keys that will provide different morphological characteristics that allow me to be able to ID the genus and the species of the bees. But it's a very long and difficult task, I have to say. I use a microscope to look at most of the keys and to zoom in for the bees. I have to check the wings, the head, the antennas, the mouth parts, and the lines on the thorax or the abdomen. But it's super interesting, and zooming in, it's really nice to see how they can shine with the microscope light. So in the meantime, I'm also working on a different project, a collaboration with the National Capital Commission and the Canadian Wildlife Federation here in Ottawa. Because we don't know much about the soil ground nesting bees prefer, and it's important to understand that. I am running an experiment testing different soil textures. So I'm using topsoil, sand, and then a gradient of them in what I call soil squares. So I have multiple squares in 2 sites now, and I will have other sites next year. It's a great way to build habitat for ground nesting bees because they like their ground. So I'm testing what texture ground nesting bees prefer to dig their nest in, and I'm also, yeah, so it's very interesting. And so far we've been pretty successful because we have seen females ground nesting bees nesting in the soil squares in the spring and summer from different species. So it's exciting. It's also something that people can notice sometimes in their backyards when they have planters or raised beds. Sometimes wild bees will nest in those places because it's attractive for them. Sorry. So I'm from a lab that studies bees here in the University of Ottawa. My supervisor is Jessica Forrest. So you can check our website, the Forest Lab, if you are interested to look at other projects from the lab. We have projects are developing in Gatineau Park, projects in the city of Ottawa, or in alpine environments in Colorado, in the USA, except for this year. Then we have projects in the lab. So we look broadly at phenology, climate change, the specializations of bees on floral families and their effect on nutrition, especially pollen from dandelion or the Asteraceae family. And then one student is looking at the effects of pesticides on the gut microbiota of bumblebees. Conservation can be done by everyone and anyone. It begins here and now by learning about these species that make up our biodiversity. And it continues in our gardens or in the products we buy. And you can ask yourself, well, how to act? What can we do? While it is important to defend wildlife habitats as it is a limiting factor in bee populations, it is also very important to support local and small-scale agriculture because there's plenty of local farmers are very keen to maintain their biodiversity in their fields. And it is important to provide undisturbed soil for ground nesters. And I haven't talked a lot about cavity nesters, but they nest in, as I mentioned before, in cavities, straws, wood. And so providing habitat for them too is also a good way to promote these species. And I'll come back to the cavity nesters in just one slide. But it is also important to provide for resources and plant flowers. So for pollen and nectar, it is important to provide flowers that bloom at different times of the year to provide food all year for the different species that will come in the spring or in the summer. And then it's better to have native flowers and grown without pesticides. So here are examples of bee hotels from the Fletcher Wildlife Garden and the Ottawa City Hall. And if you check the website, there are also a guideline on how to create your own bee hotel. You can also buy them in stores, and they provide habitat for cavity nesting bees. So they're different. They provide different size of holes, and then the bees will be sometimes nesting in them. But they also attract wasps and some parasitic species. So it creates a whole ecosystem and a whole community that will nest in those boxes, in those hotels. I would recommend to check the guides and website from the Pollinator Partnership, Pollinator Partners and the Canadian Wildlife Federation, because they have guides on plants to use, native plants, and which one to use in the different regions that are in Canada. So for example, I put this picture of the guide in Quebec, near the Saint Laurent, but then there's other guides from different regions in Ontario or other places in Canada. And there's also other projects going on to promote pollinators that are made by the Canadian Wildlife Federation. So the take-home messages are that bees are crucial for crop pollination and for wildflowers reproduction. There's a huge diversity of bees with about 900 species in Canada and more than 20,000 species worldwide. They vary in size, morphology, colors, and home range, diet breadth, and nesting habits. And my PhD project focuses on the nesting requirements and soil characteristics for ground nesting bees. And I can talk a little bit more about my project if you have more questions. I just want to be able to create habitat and provide resources for bees to better conserve them. And my project is supervised by Dr. Jessica Forrest here in Ottawa. So I just want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank all the partners that are involved in my PhD project. And I will take.
Okay, yeah, we have quite a lot of questions, that's for sure. So, and some great comments in the chat field. People have been sharing some resources, which are super. Let's see if we can go to questions. What can we do to better attract native specialists where we don't already have them? So you did cover about creating habitat. So I guess having, again, diverse plants to attract different specialists.
It's a good question, because when I think it can be difficult to attract specialist bees because you need to provide the right food resources. For example, like they will be specialists on squash flowers. So if you provide squash plants, then you might have squash bees. Um, but it's usually more common to see generalist bees in your backyards.
Okay, another one. What do you think of a recent study noting a possible positive impact cities may have on ground nesting bees due to regulated drainage? Do you know anything about that?
I didn't know, but it makes sense because so from all the literature I read on ground nesting bees, it seems like they prefer to have a soil that is well drained. From all the studies that I read, usually bees tend to nest in so a lot of species are attracted by sandy soil, it's the type of soil that is well drained. And other species also made that comment that the soil was well drained. So I'm not that surprised, but I'm curious to look into this because I didn't know about it.
Great. And another one is there a risk for overwintering bees in the raised beds in terms of freezing?
In the
In terms of freezing, so if they're in the raised beds, like often
raised
if
bed.
you've got plants in raised beds, their roots can be more susceptible to the cold. So does that apply to the bees as well?
I don't really know. I asked myself a lot of questions about the overwintering effect on wild bees because we don't know that much. And in the soil, we usually think that they're protected from the cold because they dig deep in the ground. So when they have a nest at more than 10 centimeters deeper than 10 centimeters in the ground, then they're probably well protected from the freezing cold. But then it's a good question about the raised beds. And I'm not sure.
And I wonder if you're finding some actually are digging below the depth of the raised bed too, into the actual earth below it too. So maybe there's variation there as well.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, so also if there's the potential that they're in raised beds, how do we avoid harming the overwintering ones when we reset the planters in the spring?
Yes. So that's something I'm only starting to, well, we are starting to realize, especially in my lab. For example, my supervisor in the spring, she did some gardening in her backyard, and then she realized that she actually might have disturbed ground nesting bees because they were all flying around looking for their nest entrance. And and so we were talking about it and thinking, what can we do to should we just leave our ground undisturbed? And I think that's maybe one solution is to have parts of the backyard with undisturbed ground, and then some where we have, I don't know, we grow vegetables, we plant flowers, we add things that can be disturbed. But at the same time, the offspring will be deep in the ground. So they might not be affected by the gardening that we do on the soil surface or in the first 5 centimeters of the ground.
And it's hard because there's so many species of bees, so many different characteristics, so many lifestyles, and so many sort of setups in our gardens in terms of what to do. It just keep watching and checking and observing and seeing what we can do. And I know even in general, Lee Reich talks a lot about, others do as well, in general, disturbing the soil as little as possible, just in terms of the plants and their needs. So we're also helping the roots of plants as well. As well as the bees as well, I guess. When looking for the ground nests and for bee hotels, how to make sure that you don't get wasps?
You can't. There will always be wasps, but it is and there are different species of wasp than the ones that we're thinking. Here, they're like black wasps. They're and actually, I'm promoting bees, but I will also say this: wasps can be very useful because they allow for biocontrol on farms, and they will eat some of the pests that are on crops or plants. Some will eat spiders. So if you they are also useful. So it's in a good way. Those bee hotels that are advertised for bee habitat, they're also good for wasps if they can provide habitat for them too, because they're also part of the biodiversity and they also have a useful impact for us.
And we should say too also that there's a difference between social bees and solitary bees, social wasps and solitary wasps. And the social bees and wasps, because they have this very structured colony that they have invested in, and therefore they're more inclined to want to protect it if you're very close to it. I mean, I've sat down with a social kind of wasp, just quietly scraping some wood off my deck to get wood, and totally peaceful interaction. Same with them when they're on the flowers, totally peaceful interaction. When you go too close to their home, like really close, then they get agitated. That's when they're going to want to protect. But a lot of the solitary wasps, I'm learning, they don't want to sting you. Their stingers evolved to simply immobilize prey, bring it back to their solitary nest. And I know we've had, like, I think it's called Isodontia wasp at our insect hotel at work. And you see it's neat. It stuffs the dry grass in the end of the hole, and totally peaceful. And again, as you say, they're helping by keeping the potential pest species in check. So yeah, it's almost like, again, that dance. What kind of species are you talking about? And just taking care. And so on that note, someone has a question. I've heard that bee hotels also have their disadvantages since they can host diseases when not cared for properly. Have you heard the same? Do you think that bee hotels can also harm bees too?
There are conflicting results about bee hotels because so the good thing is that they provide nesting structures for cavity nesting bees. So they will provide habitat, and if it's in a place that is limited with habitat, then that's a good thing. At the same time, they tend to also attract parasitic species that will parasitize the nest of the bees, and they sometimes just by having a bigger population at the same spot, there might be diseases or fungi that will develop in those structures. So I think in the end, it counterbalances the positive effects, but it is, I think, especially in urban habitat, it can be good to provide habitat for bees because they might be limited. But in nature, in the wild or in natural habitat, I'm not sure it's necessary, and I think they do well on their own. The wild bees, they are able to find holes and cavities in dead trees or anywhere they're searching.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because again, also we do have information online, and we'll have links and such to show you on the last slide. But you have a lot of habitat, a lot of diversity of tree types, shrub types, perennial types, plant types in general, and the layers. And as you said, like maybe a log or a dead standing tree or a stump, you're creating habitat, and therefore nature will take care of itself. It's like supplementing gets a bit tricky, because then you got to see, okay, do I need to change it every couple of years? Don't use plastic because that creates condensation, et cetera. It gets complicated when you do it yourself, and it's great. We love the one we have at work. But I even heard from someone saying, well, they're finding maybe just the smaller ones are better and place them discreetly under grass. So people are still discovering that, aren't they? They're still, I think, learning about this too. And this one says, I live in Prince Rupert, BC, which is part of the rainforest. How does one protect the ground nesters from some of our deluges?
From?
Sorry, I'm not pronouncing it right. Deluge is when you have lots of water coming in, all of a sudden, a big rainfall.
Oh, okay. Good question. Well, so some bees, well, if they're deep in the ground and the water is just on the surface, then they might be fine. But if it's very, I don't really know how to answer this question.
I mean, maybe also the fact they've evolved there, maybe they just know where to go and what to do and when, maybe even who knows.
Yeah, so that's for example, one key question that I'm asking is how do they choose their nest location? Because I think they do choose. They look at when they're searching to create a nest, the ground nesters, they go on the ground and they will have this behavior of searching, tapping with the antennas, and just looking at some soil fixtures that we have no idea. We don't understand what they're looking for, but they are looking for something. And because there are different criteria that could be key for the survival and success of the offspring, I think they're looking for these criteria. So it could be the soil moisture, the soil temperature. And so we talked about drained soils, but I think that's one component that they might be looking. Is this area very well drained, or is it very too moisturized? And they might also be looking at the soil texture, the soil hardness, because if it's too hard to dig, then they might have a lot of difficulties to create their nest and to have multiple offspring. So yeah, these are all components that I'm looking at a little, but they're very hard to look individually, because it's hard to separate them from. It's hard to be able to separate the soil's texture from the moisture, because they will be linked.
Great. Now, in many semi-rural urban areas, there is an overpopulation of deer. Does this possibly affect native bee populations?
Deers?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe so. So the problem with deers is not the problem, but one consequence of having a big population of deers is that they will eat a lot of they will have like herbivory consequence. Well, they will be eating a lot of the grass, the little shrubs and trees, and sometimes flowers. So the only consequence I'm thinking is that they might be eating and removing some flowering plants from the environment. And if it's under the trees, or if it's a place where there isn't a lot of flowering plants, they will just remove some flowering resources for the bees. So that's the only negative impact that I can think of. Otherwise, I don't think there would be a consequence for wild bees, I think.
Great. All right, and someone else asks, can you please share the links for the plans and designs for building bee hotels that you mentioned? Now, if you had them on your screen, this is being recorded and you'll be able to access it in a few days' time. So it will be shared that way. So I'm not sure if you mentioned anything verbally, but if you did, we can get it into the follow-up email that'll come out to you in a few days' time. Another one is, I would like to document the species that live in the park I work for in Montreal. Do you have ID guides to recommend?
Yes. So there are some basic guides. So it's for the bees, it's really hard to do identification. There are some basic guides that will allow to identify to some genus level, or just to be able to separate groups. So for example, we have the group of the green sweat bees that is more easy to identify. It's easier to just identify this group because some of these green tiny sweat bees will be difficult to identify to species level or even genus level. So I can recommend some. I will send some links to Sarah after this webinar for some tips on identification. Otherwise, there are some very big books with different keys for identification, but they're very. It's a bit more tricky. You would need a microscope, and you would need to really look into this. But I will also share guides for bumblebee identification because bumblebees are a bit easier to identify as they're a bit bigger.
Great. And also I've got a few books that I've been using for me with my own interests, so I can include those titles in the email that we send out, because I know Heather Holm has got a great book that I've been using.
I actually I would recommend this book, Bees in Your Backyard. Yeah, because it's a great book. It's not very expensive, and they give they will give some keys to identify bees. So they're broad, easier to use. They're broad keys, easier to use, and they are very good because it allows us to be able to distinguish the genus. But it doesn't go to species level because it's usually very difficult. But it's a great resource for bee identification.
Great, thank you. And I even wonder if we should maybe get you to stop sharing your screen, because maybe it would make you bigger than when you show your book. People actually could see it better too. I'm not even sure.
Yeah,
but
sure. Yeah.
It's at that.
You also had some resources ready for sharing. I don't know if you wanted to.
Sure, I'll put that on the screen in a few minutes. Sure, then. Okay. Let's get to another question first. So the ground bees use the same nest for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Some bees, they will use the same nest over and over, generations after generations. Usually they're social bees, even though they're wild bees, they live with a social organization with a queen and workers that will handle different tasks, and they will use the same nest, and the nest will usually become bigger and bigger, or it will just like extend over the years. And it's super interesting to be able to see this in the wild. But some nests have been observed for more than 50 years.
Oh,
yes,
very cool.
It's super cool. Some bees that are specialized on alfalfa. No, there's a ground nesting bee, a specialized one that will create huge populations in the same area, and they can live there for years. It's really cool.
Wow. Okay, so another question, and I think we've got just a few more minutes here. What do the young do when they're trying to exit the nest, if the hole gets blocked with soil or otherwise?
So when they exit the nest, if they get blocked, I think they would just excavate their way out, because that's what they do when they emerge, the offspring, because they're deep in the ground. So I think they just excavate their way out, and I'm pretty sure that even the adults, the females that are building a nest, if they get caught, if their nest is just getting closed, I don't know, by any disturbance, I'm sure they're able to just get out.
Because also, I mean, I think a lot of the solitary bee nests, they're sealed at the end, aren't they, with either chewed leaves or mud? So they have to be designed to get through that anyway, don't they? That protective layer that was made for them.
Yeah, yeah. Usually, a nest that is being active, they usually don't close it, but some of them do, like you say, to I think to just hide from predators.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see. How many nests might a bee have? How many offspring in a season? Do they live more than 1 year or just one season?
Okay, it's a good question, and I will say it depends on the species. So it really depends on the species. Some bees will have, so I'm not even sure, but I think some bees mostly have one nest and multiple cells per nest, where they have multiple offspring. They can have 5 to 12 offspring, maybe more. It really depends. It's never, and it also depends a lot on the females, just the individual female, because sometimes an individual really have 50 offspring, and sometimes one individual will have less than 5. So it really depends. I think, well, the social species are able to just have more because they're able to create different offsprings. And what happens is that they sometimes have different generations in the same year. So in the same summer, they can be 2 to 3 different generations of different daughters of the from the same species, well, from the same population. So it's
Great.
interesting to see that, but I don't want to confuse you too much. So yeah, so most solitary bees will have a 1 year generation. When they emerge, they build their nest, they create offspring, and then the offspring will just emerge the year after, or the season after. But some bees do have multiple generations per year.
Okay, so how much does cultivation of a field or garden affect ground nesting bees, i.e. the squash bees?
So cultivation, they can be, I'm not sure about the answer. There can be different factors that will have an effect on the bees. For example, well, the fact that just this sort of tillage that we do, that can have an impact on the offspring, but it's there aren't very specific results. Well, the results have been conflicted. Like sometimes people say that it will diminish the offspring by so twice of the offspring will be killed by tillage, but some other studies have shown that the offspring are not affected. So I think it depends on the deep on
How deeply they dig, maybe?
sorry, what?
Like how deeply the person digs?
Yes, yes. The deeper the soil work is, the more chances there are that you might be affecting the offspring.
Great. And then are ground nesting bees found in more specific areas? They require bare soil. So would gardens and meadows not be ideal, but rather forested areas?
Right. So I mentioned bare soil because it is a common thought, and is also found in the literature, that ground nesting bees are found in bare soil. I'm actually not sure that bees prefer bare soil. They're just easier to find the nest entrances are easier to find on their soil, and maybe that's why we can see them, and maybe that's why we think that they prefer their soil. I think it actually depends on the species, because in the experiment that I'm doing with the different soil squares, I was thinking, well, I should remove the weeds, and this way the soil will remain bare ground and with no disturbance. So I thought it would attract the bees, but then I realized that sometimes weeds were growing and the bees were nesting right under, right at the base of the plant. So I was wondering if they were actually choosing this spot because there was a weed growing and there was vegetation, but they could just hide better the entrance, or just find the nest entrance more easily with the weed being here and being like a landmark in the landscape.
It's a neat idea. Yeah. And I know, for instance, with the Gardening for Wildlife program, we tell people, you never know where they're going to nest. And so we do like mulch in the gardens because it helps the plant roots in many ways. But it's great to have a few spots perhaps that are unmulched, so that, again, if it's a spot that a bee can go to, can easily get to. If you have to use mulch, use the finest mulch possible. But again, if you can have a variety, I guess that can help them have more chance of nesting.
Yeah, I think if I were to give recommendations, I would leave a spot in the garden that is bare, because then the sun will heat this area, and then the usually ground nesting bees like to have a more a ground with a little higher temperature.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so I'm not sure, it's not based on facts or results, but I think it would be easier, it would work.
Yeah, sounds it. What I'm going to do is there's a couple more questions, but I'm going to share my screen because some of you may have to be leaving. I see some of you have had to leave. Let's see here. So I think you can see that. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Some resources, some links. Again, iNaturalist is a really cool resource if you want to share pictures of what you find. And then if you don't know what it is, there are lots of people online to help you identify it. What you see can also help researchers in terms of knowing what species of native plant or animal is where, plus different things to support. But okay, so while you have that on your screen to access, a couple more questions. I've heard that every third bite is because of bees. They play a huge role in pollination, there's no doubt. Is this because of the abundance of bees, i.e. more than birds, or the anatomy of bees that allow the easy transfer of pollen?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. So I've heard that every third bite is because of bees. They play a huge role in pollination, there's no doubt. Is this because of the abundancy of bees, i.e. there are more bees than birds, or the anatomy of bees that allow the easy transfer of pollen?
So the first part of the fact that there's an abundance of bees is, I think, one key component. They are very abundant. They are also very diverse, and their diversity allows for a better pollination of all the plants that are existing. And then for me, it's really based on their morphology, because they have hair on their body, and they have hair more specifically that is branched. So then the pollen is kind of stuck on their body, and they will not, they're doing this not willingly sometimes, but just visiting a flowers, the pollen will just fall on their body, and they will be transferring this pollen to another flower when they move on to the next flower. And sometimes they're just looking for nectar, but they will have pollen falling on their body, and they will just allow for pollination. I think this is the really why they're so good pollinators.
Okay, well, one last question here. Without laws requiring labeling for pesticides, what is the best way to know whether the plants and flowers we buy are free of neonics pesticides? I know we always tell people just to ask at the nursery and to ask, and if they don't know, and if they don't seem like they know, at least you've raised their awareness about it. I know our local nursery, they do not grow anything with neonics. They grow everything themselves. However, despite this decision of theirs, they did get some seed in this year, and they found in the fine print that they were treated with neonics, so they sent them back. So you never know how diligent, how careful, how knowledgeable your nursery staff are. So just keep asking the question from my perspective. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Cecile.
I don't. I really don't know. I'm not really aware of. Well, I'm not comfortable enough with the regulations here. But for the crops, I know that it's some crops will be almost 100% for sure. They will have they will be coated with neonicotinoids, but I don't know for other flowers and plants.
I know the Canadian Wildlife Federation does have, initiatives to try to stop and ban a lot of these harmful products. Neonics is certainly one of them. So check on our website. We have had something called Ban with a Plan that you can add your signature to. I'm not sure if that's still running right now, but check it out. And if I find something timely, I can stick it in the email when we follow up with you. So this is pretty much over our time, but it's been wonderful, Cecile. I'm so glad that you were able to do this with us again in English. Thank you so much. It was
Thank you.
very much requested by everybody. So it's super, and I'm glad we had such a great turnout, everybody. So I'm glad you were able to join us. There is a recording, so check out the links that Cecile shared and I've got here. Again, will be found in the recording online. So I wish you all a great day, and thanks again. Thanks, Cecile. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. I'm just going to do one more thing before I close it down, Cecile. Oh, and people are saying thank you. You're very welcome. Thanks for joining. Oh, someone said I've really learned a lot. Oh, that's lovely. I'm glad.
Really glad to hear that.
Merci, Cecile, from Amy McPherson, and that's great. So I'm actually going to go through these comments after, and if there's anything that we missed, I will definitely make sure that we get it in the email that we have as a follow-up. Great, I'm just going to do that, and then I'll close it down. Great. Oh, someone said it's the best webinar on wild bees I've seen this year. C'était très instructif. That's lovely. Oh, that's great. I have to do this before I stop it because otherwise I'm going to lose this. Anyway.
I'm trying to check the questions.
Yeah, I think the number went up actually just after we stopped. So maybe, I'm not sure if we have some more there that were added. All right. So Cecile, I'm going to end it then now.
Okay.
And then you can email me at your leisure any of those links but what the book that was not, in the presentation already.
Right. And if you have questions that I wasn't able to answer, you can send them to me and I can write a short answer.